The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Rosehaven Palace as Princess Charlotte walked through the grand corridors that had been her home for 17 years. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ornate walls, each sound a reminder of the weight that pressed down on her young shoulders. Today was different from all the others, though. She couldn't yet understand why her heart felt so heavy. Charlotte had always been the picture of royal grace. Her auburn hair caught the light like spun copper, and her green eyes sparkled with an intelligence that impressed even the most seasoned diplomats who visited the kingdom of Valdoria. She carried herself with the poise that had been drilled into her since childhood, every movement calculated to project strength and dignity befitting her station as the heir to the throne. The kingdom of Valdoria was a prosperous land, nestled between rolling hills and crystal-clear lakes. Its people were known for their craftsmanship, their warm hospitality, and their unwavering loyalty to the royal family. For generations, the crown had passed from parent to child, each ruler adding their own chapter to the kingdom's rich history. Charlotte's parents, King Edmund and Queen Isabella, were beloved by their subjects, known for their fairness and wisdom in governance. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, shadows were beginning to form. Charlotte had noticed changes in recent weeks that troubled her deeply. Her father's advisor, Lord Blackwood, had been visiting more frequently, often staying late into the night for hushed conversations behind closed doors. The castle staff moved with a nervous energy that hadn't been there before, and even her beloved governess, Miss Adelaide, seemed distracted during their daily lessons. Charlotte paused at the window overlooking the palace gardens, where she had spent countless hours as a child, chasing butterflies and picking flowers with her younger brother, Prince Alexander. Those carefree days seemed like distant memories now. At 17, she was expected to understand matters of state, to prepare for the day when the crown would rest upon her head. Yet nobody had prepared her for the feeling that something fundamental was shifting in her world. The gardens below were meticulously maintained, every hedge trimmed to perfection, every flower bed arranged in pleasing patterns that had remained unchanged for decades. The stability of these familiar sights usually brought her comfort, but today they seemed almost mocking in their permanence, while everything else felt uncertain. As she stood there lost in thought, Charlotte caught sight of a figure moving through the garden paths. It was Captain Marcus Thornfield, the youngest captain in the Royal Guard's history. At 25, he had already distinguished himself through his unwavering dedication to protecting the royal family and his innovative approaches to palace security. His dark hair and serious demeanor made him stand out among the other guards, but it was his eyes that Charlotte noticed most. They held a depth that suggested he understood far more about the world than his years should allow. Marcus had been assigned to the palace guard 3 years ago, rising quickly through the ranks due to his exceptional skills and absolute loyalty. Unlike many of the other guards who maintained a formal distance from the royal family, Marcus had a way of seeing Charlotte not just as a princess, but as a person. Their interactions had always been proper and professional, but there was an undercurrent of mutual respect that had developed over time. Charlotte watched as Marcus conducted his morning patrol, checking the security of the garden perimeter with the thoroughness that had made him invaluable to the palace's protection. His movements were precise and purposeful, yet there was something different about his posture today. Even from her vantage point high above, she could sense a tension in his bearing that mirrored her own unease. The princess turned away from the window and continued her walk through the palace, her mind wandering to the strange conversation she had overheard the previous evening. She had been returning to her chambers after dinner when she heard voices from her father's study. The door had been slightly ajar, and she couldn't help but catch fragments of what was being discussed. "The northern provinces are growing restless," Lord Blackwood had been saying. "The tax increases have not been well received, and there are reports of organized resistance forming." Her father's voice had carried a weariness she had never heard before. "I had hoped the additional revenue would allow us to strengthen our defenses without burdening the people further. Perhaps we moved too quickly." "There may be another way, Your Majesty," Blackwood had replied, his tone carrying implications that Charlotte couldn't quite grasp. "A strategic alliance could solve many of our problems at once." The conversation had continued in whispers too low for her to hear, but the word alliance had stuck in her mind. In royal terms, alliances often meant one thing: marriage. The thought had kept her awake most of the night, staring at the intricate patterns on her bedroom ceiling while wondering if her future was being decided without her knowledge or consent. Charlotte made her way to the library, hoping that losing herself in books might provide some distraction from her troubled thoughts. The royal library was one of her favorite places in the entire palace, its towering shelves filled with volumes collected over centuries. The scent of old leather and parchment always calmed her mind, and the quiet atmosphere allowed her to think clearly away from the constant bustle of court life. As she selected a volume of poetry from one of the lower shelves, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Miss Adelaide entering the library, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, as if she had been walking quickly through the corridors. "Princess Charlotte," Miss Adelaide said, offering a curtsy that seemed more hurried than usual. "I was looking for you. Your mother has requested your presence in the blue drawing room." Something in her governess's tone made Charlotte's stomach tighten. "Is everything well, Miss Adelaide?" The older woman's smile seemed forced, not reaching her eyes. "Of course, Your Highness. I believe she wishes to discuss the upcoming Harvest Festival preparations." Charlotte nodded, though she suspected the conversation would involve far more than festival planning. As she made her way toward the blue drawing room, she passed several courtiers who offered their usual bows and pleasantries, but she noticed how their eyes seemed to avoid meeting hers directly. The feeling that everyone around her knew something she didn't continued to grow stronger with each passing moment. The blue drawing room was one of the more intimate spaces in the palace, decorated in soft blues and golds that created a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Queen Isabella was seated by the fireplace, her elegant hands folded in her lap, but her posture was rigid in a way that immediately put Charlotte on alert. "Mother," Charlotte said, offering the appropriate curtsy before taking the seat across from the Queen. Queen Isabella's smile was warm but strained. "Charlotte, my dear, please sit. We have much to discuss." The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air between them, and Charlotte found herself holding her breath, waiting for whatever news would finally explain the strange atmosphere that had settled over the palace like a suffocating blanket. Queen Isabella studied her daughter's face for a long moment before speaking, her maternal instincts clearly warring with her royal duties. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast soft patterns across the Persian rug, but the beauty of the setting did nothing to ease the tension that filled the room like a living thing. "Charlotte," the Queen began, her voice carrying the careful control that years of royal training had instilled in her, "you have grown into a remarkable young woman. Your father and I have watched with pride as you've embraced your responsibilities and prepared for the role that awaits you." Charlotte felt her heart begin to race, recognizing the careful phrasing that preceded difficult conversations. She had heard similar words before, announcements of increased duties or challenging diplomatic situations. This time, however, something in her mother's tone suggested the stakes were much higher. "Thank you, Mother," Charlotte replied, maintaining the composure that had been expected of her since childhood. "I have always tried to honor our family and our kingdom." Queen Isabella rose from her chair and moved to stand by the window, her back to Charlotte. For several moments she remained silent, watching the activity in the courtyard below where servants went about their daily tasks, oblivious to the momentous conversation taking place in the room above. "The kingdom faces challenges that require difficult decisions," the Queen finally said, her reflection in the window showing the strain she had been trying to hide. "Your father and I have spent countless hours considering all possible solutions, consulting with advisors and examining every alternative." Charlotte's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles white against the deep blue fabric of her dress. "What kind of challenges, Mother?" The Queen turned back to face her daughter, and Charlotte was startled to see tears glistening in her eyes, something she had witnessed only once before, during her grandmother's funeral 5 years earlier. "The northern provinces grow restless under the increased taxation needed to maintain our defenses. Lord Blackwood's reports suggest that without immediate action, we could face open rebellion within months. Our treasury, while not empty, cannot sustain both the military presence needed to maintain order and the infrastructure improvements our people desperately need." Charlotte nodded, having suspected that the kingdom faced financial difficulties based on the fragments of conversations she had overheard. Surely there must be ways to address these concerns without resorting to extreme measures. "We have explored every option," Queen Isabella said, returning to her seat. Reducing military spending would leave us vulnerable to external threats, while maintaining current taxation levels risks internal conflict. The Merchants Guild has already reduced their voluntary contributions, and the harvest this year, while adequate, was not the abundance we had hoped for. The princess leaned forward slightly, her analytical mind already working through possibilities. What about trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms? Or perhaps restructuring the existing tax system to place less burden on the northern provinces specifically? Queen Isabella's expression softened with genuine admiration for her daughter's quick thinking. You demonstrate exactly the kind of wisdom that will make you an excellent queen someday. We have indeed explored those options. However, the neighboring kingdoms face their own economic challenges, and several have actually reduced their trade commitments to focus on domestic concerns. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand where this conversation was heading. In her studies of royal history, she had learned that when kingdoms faced such dire circumstances, solutions often came at great personal cost to the ruling families. The Kingdom of Astoria has extended an offer, the Queen continued, her voice growing quieter. Their Crown Prince Roderick is seeking a wife, and an alliance between our kingdoms could provide the financial stability we need, while also strengthening our military position. The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow, even though she had suspected this possibility since overhearing her father's conversation the previous night. Prince Roderick of Astoria was known throughout the region as a competent ruler in waiting, but also as a man whose interests lay primarily in military conquest and expanding his future kingdom's influence. She had met him briefly at a diplomatic function 2 years earlier and remembered him as intelligent but cold, with eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything and everyone around him. I see, Charlotte managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. And what are the terms of this proposed alliance? Queen Isabella reached across the space between their chairs and took her daughter's hand. The marriage would unite our kingdoms under a joint rule, with you maintaining your position as heir to Valdoria's throne while also becoming Astoria's future queen. The economic benefits would be immediate. Astoria has offered significant financial support as well as military assistance in maintaining order in our northern provinces. Charlotte's mind raced through the implications. A political marriage was not uncommon among royalty, and she had always known that her eventual marriage would likely serve strategic purposes beyond personal happiness. However, she had hoped for more time, and perhaps for the possibility of finding love within the constraints of political necessity. How much time do I have to consider this proposal? She asked, proud that her voice remained level despite the turmoil in her heart. Prince Roderick will be arriving next week for formal negotiations, her mother replied gently. Your father hopes to have preliminary agreements in place before the autumn council session, when the northern lords will gather to voice their concerns. The timeline was much shorter than Charlotte had expected, leaving little room for the careful consideration such a momentous decision deserved. She understood the political realities that drove the urgency, but the human cost of moving so quickly felt overwhelming. Does Alexander know? Charlotte asked, thinking of her 15-year-old brother who had always been her closest confidant within the family. Not yet. We felt it was important to speak with you first, given that you would be most directly affected by this decision. Queen Isabella paused, studying her daughter's face. Charlotte, I want you to know that your father and I do not make this request lightly. If we believed there was any other viable solution, we would pursue it without hesitation. Charlotte nodded, understanding the impossible position her parents faced. As rulers, they were responsible for the welfare of thousands of people, and personal desires, even those of their own children, had to be weighed against the greater good of the kingdom.
I understand the necessity, Mother, Charlotte said finally.
But I would like some time to process this information before Prince Roderick's arrival. Of course, the Queen replied, relief evident in her voice at her daughter's mature response. Perhaps you might find it helpful to walk in the gardens. Fresh air often helps clarify difficult thoughts. Charlotte rose from her chair, offering the appropriate courtesy to her mother before making her way toward the door. As she reached for the handle, Queen Isabella's voice stopped her. Charlotte, I know this is not the future you had imagined for yourself, but I have faith that you will find a way to honor both your duty to the kingdom and your own happiness. You have always been remarkably resourceful. The princess managed a small smile, though it felt forced. Thank you, Mother. I will give this matter the serious consideration it deserves. As Charlotte left the blue drawing room, she felt as though she were walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The familiar corridors of the palace seemed different now, charged with a new reality that made everything appear slightly foreign. Servants who had known her since childhood offered their usual respectful greetings, but she found herself wondering if they already knew about the proposed marriage, if they were looking at her with pity or curiosity about her reaction to the news. She made her way toward the gardens, desperate for the solace that nature had always provided during times of stress. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the carefully manicured lawns and creating a golden glow that normally would have lifted her spirits. Today, however, even the beauty of her surroundings felt muted by the weight of her circumstances. As she walked along the familiar paths, Charlotte's mind turned to all the dreams and possibilities that this marriage would foreclose. She had always known that her life would be constrained by duty, but there had been moments when she allowed herself to imagine different futures, perhaps falling in love with someone who could understand both her position and her person, or having more time to prepare for the enormous responsibilities of queenship. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Captain Thornfield approaching along one of the intersecting paths. His usual professional demeanor seemed softer in the golden afternoon light, and for a moment Charlotte wondered what it would be like to confide in someone who wasn't bound by the complex protocols of court life. Captain Marcus Thornfield had been conducting his routine evening patrol when he noticed Princess Charlotte walking alone in the gardens. Something in her posture immediately caught his attention. The usual confident grace that characterized her movements seemed absent, replaced by a heaviness that made her appear smaller somehow, as though she were carrying an invisible burden. As someone trained to observe and protect, Marcus had developed an acute sensitivity to changes in the behavior of those under his care. Over the past 3 years of service, he had come to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when members of the royal family were troubled or distressed. Today, every line of Princess Charlotte's body language suggested that she had received news of significant import, and not news that brought her joy. Marcus found himself at a crossroads that he had never expected to face in his military career. Protocol dictated that he maintain a respectful distance unless specifically summoned or unless he perceived a direct threat to the princess's safety. However, his conscience compelled him to ensure that she was well, particularly since she appeared to be struggling with some internal conflict. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden paths, creating a patchwork of light and shade that seemed to mirror the complexity of the situation. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to make quick, decisive judgments, but this moment required a delicacy that his military training hadn't specifically prepared him for. After several moments of internal debate, Marcus made his decision and approached along the path, timing his steps to create enough noise that the princess would be aware of his presence without being startled. As their paths converged near the rose garden, Princess Charlotte's favorite spot in the entire palace grounds, he offered the appropriate salute. "Your Highness," he said, his voice carrying the respect that protocol demanded while also conveying a warmth that spoke to his genuine concern. "I hope I'm not intruding on your solitude." Charlotte looked up at him, and Marcus was struck immediately by the evident distress in her green eyes. Despite her attempts to maintain royal composure, he could see that she had been fighting back tears, and her usual bright smile was nowhere to be seen. "Captain Thornfield," she replied, managing to summon a semblance of her normal gracious manner. "Not at all. I was simply enjoying the beauty of the gardens on this lovely afternoon." Marcus recognized the polite deflection for what it was, but he also noticed that she didn't dismiss him or continue walking, suggesting that perhaps she welcomed the company, even if she couldn't openly admit to needing it. "The roses are particularly beautiful this time of year," he observed, genuinely admiring the carefully tended beds that surrounded them. "Your gardening staff has outdone themselves with this season's cultivation." Charlotte nodded, but her gaze seemed distant, as though she were seeing something far beyond the immediate beauty of their surroundings. "Yes, they work very hard to maintain the garden's beauty. It's one of the few constants in a world that seems to change so rapidly." There was something in her tone that suggested she was speaking about more than just gardening, and Marcus felt his protective instincts sharpen. He had witnessed enough of court life to understand that members of the royal family often faced pressures and decisions that remained hidden from public view, but the depth of sadness he saw in Princess Charlotte's eyes concerned him deeply. "Forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, Your Highness," Marcus said carefully, "but you seem troubled by something." As someone sworn to protect and serve your family, I want you to know that if there's anything within my power to assist with, you need only ask." Charlotte turned to look at him fully for the first time since their conversation began, and Marcus saw surprise flicker across her features. It was clear that she hadn't expected such directness from someone in his position, but rather than seeming offended by his boldness, she appeared almost relieved that someone had finally acknowledged what she was feeling. "That's very kind of you, Captain," she said, her voice softer than usual. "But I'm afraid the matter that troubles me is not one that military expertise can address." Marcus nodded, understanding that she was likely dealing with some aspect of royal responsibility that placed demands on her beyond anything a guard could help with. However, his years of service had taught him that sometimes the most valuable thing he could offer was simply a listening ear from someone outside the complex web of court politics and family expectations. "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but sometimes speaking about our concerns aloud can help clarify our thoughts, even if the listener cannot offer practical solutions." Charlotte studied his face for several moments as though weighing whether she could trust him with whatever was weighing so heavily on her mind. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out in her expression, the desire for someone to confide in warring, with the ingrained caution that royal training had instilled in her about sharing personal matters with those outside her immediate family circle. "You have always been different from the other guards," she said finally, her observation carrying a note of curiosity rather than criticism. "You see things that others miss, and you speak with a thoughtfulness that suggests your mind encompasses more than military strategy." Marcus felt a flush of pride at her words, though he tried to maintain his professional demeanor. "I believe that truly protecting someone requires understanding not just external threats, but also the burdens they carry and the challenges they face. A guard who only watches for physical dangers may miss the signs of other kinds of distress." "That's a remarkably perceptive philosophy," Charlotte replied, and for the first time since their conversation began, Marcus caught a glimpse of her genuine smile. "I suspect you see more of what goes on in this palace than many people realize. It's my job to observe and understand," Marcus said simply. "But more than that, I care about the welfare of those I serve. It troubles me to see you so clearly distressed." Charlotte looked away, her gaze turning toward the palace where windows were beginning to glow with the warm light of evening candles. From their vantage point in the garden, the building looked like something from a fairy tale, beautiful and serene. Marcus knew, however, that appearances could be deceiving, and that within those walls, complicated political and personal dramas played out daily. "I've received news today that will change the entire course of my life," Charlotte said quietly, her words carrying a weight that made Marcus's chest tighten with empathy. "News that I should probably accept gracefully, as it serves the greater good of the kingdom, but which fills me with a sadness I don't quite know how to process." Marcus felt his protective instincts flare even stronger. While he couldn't know the specifics of what had been decided, the tone of her words suggested that Princess Charlotte was being asked to make a significant personal sacrifice for political reasons. In his 3 years of palace service, he had witnessed enough of royal life to understand that members of the royal family rarely had the luxury of making purely personal choices. "I'm sorry to hear that you're facing such a difficult situation," he said, his voice carrying sincere sympathy. "While I may not understand the complexities of royal decision-making, I can see that whatever has been asked of you weighs heavily on your heart." Charlotte turned back to face him, and Marcus was struck by how young she looked in that moment, despite her 17 years and the poise that usually made her seem older than her age. There was something vulnerable in her expression that made him want to shield her from whatever was causing her pain, even though he knew such protection was far beyond his authority or ability to provide. "Tell me, Captain Thornfield," she said, her voice taking on a note of genuine curiosity, "do you believe that duty and happiness can coexist, or must one always be sacrificed for the other?" The question caught Marcus off guard with its directness and its philosophical complexity. He realized that Princess Charlotte was not simply making conversation, but rather seeking genuine insight from someone whose perspective might differ from those of the advisors and family members who typically guided her decisions. "I believe," Marcus said carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he would use in planning a military strategy, "that the highest form of duty is one that serves others while also honoring the authentic self of the person performing it. When duty requires us to become someone fundamentally different from who we are, It may serve a short-term purpose but often creates long-term problems that extend beyond the individual to affect everyone around them. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly at his response, clearly not having expected such a thoughtful philosophical perspective from a military officer. Marcus could see her mind working through the implications of what he had said, applying his words to whatever decision she was facing. "That's a much more nuanced view than I had anticipated," she admitted. "Most people seem to believe that royal duty requires absolute self-sacrifice, regardless of personal cost." "Perhaps," Marcus replied, "but I've observed enough of leadership to understand that the most effective leaders are those who find ways to align their personal values with their responsibilities. When that alignment exists, duty becomes not a burden but a source of strength and purpose." As the evening shadows continued to lengthen around them, Marcus found himself hoping that their conversation might provide Princess Charlotte with some small measure of comfort or clarity regarding whatever difficult decision she faced. He knew that his role in her life was limited and carefully circumscribed by protocol, but he also understood that sometimes the most valuable gift one person could give another was simply the assurance that they were seen and understood in their struggle. The days that followed Charlotte's conversation with Captain Thornfield passed in a blur of activity as the palace prepared for Prince Roderick's arrival. Despite the seemingly normal bustle of preparations, additional staff being hired, guest quarters being prepared, and elaborate meal plans being developed, Charlotte felt as though she were watching everything happen from a great distance, as if observing someone else's life rather than living her own. She found herself thinking constantly about Marcus's words regarding the alignment of duty and personal values. His perspective had planted a seed of possibility in her mind that she hadn't previously considered. Perhaps there was a way to honor her responsibilities to the kingdom while also remaining true to herself. The question that haunted her was how to discover what that path might look like. During this period, Charlotte made a point of spending more time in various parts of the palace and its grounds, ostensibly to oversee preparations, but actually to observe and think. She wanted to understand more deeply what was at stake, not just for herself, but for all the people whose lives would be affected by the decisions being made in the royal chambers. In the kitchens, she watched the cooking staff work with practiced efficiency, their conversations revealing genuine affection for the royal family, alongside concerns about rumors of unrest in the northern provinces. In the stables, the grooms spoke in worried tones about reduced budgets affecting the care of the horses, while in the servants' quarters, she overheard discussions about family members in the north who had written letters describing increased hardships under the new taxation. These conversations, gathered in fragments as she moved through the palace, painted a picture of a kingdom under strain, but also one where the bonds between rulers and subjects remained strong. People were worried, but they still trusted the royal family to make decisions that would ultimately serve everyone's best interests. The weight of that trust felt almost overwhelming to Charlotte as she contemplated the marriage that could provide solutions to so many problems. 3 days before Prince Roderick's scheduled arrival, Charlotte encountered Captain Thornfield again, this time in the palace library, where she had gone seeking solitude among the books that had always provided her comfort. She was surprised to find him there, as it was unusual for guards to have business in the library during their duty hours. "Captain," she said, looking up from the volume of history she had been attempting to read without much success. "I didn't expect to find you here." Marcus looked slightly embarrassed to be discovered in the library, but his expression also carried a hint of determination that suggested his presence was intentional rather than accidental. "Your Highness," he said, offering his usual respectful bow. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was hoping I might have a few moments to speak with you privately if such a conversation would not be inappropriate." Charlotte set down her book, intrigued by his request and grateful for any distraction from her troubled thoughts. "Of course, Captain. Please sit down." Marcus remained standing for a moment, clearly gathering his courage for whatever he intended to say. When he finally took the chair across from her, Charlotte could see that he was struggling with some internal conflict, as though he were about to cross a line that protocol had clearly established. "I have been thinking extensively about our conversation in the garden," he began carefully, "and I find myself compelled to share something with you, even though doing so may be overstepping the boundaries of my position." Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her attention fully focused on his words. "Please, speak freely. I value your perspective more than you might realize. Marcus took a deep breath before continuing. I have heard talk among the staff about Prince Roderick's impending visit and the purpose of his stay. While I understand that such matters are far above my station to comment upon, I also understand that you may be facing a decision that could fundamentally alter the course of your life. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm with a combination of embarrassment and relief. She had wondered whether the news of the potential marriage had spread beyond the inner circle of the royal family and their closest advisors. Hearing Marcus acknowledge it directly was somehow both mortifying and liberating. Yes, she said simply, deciding that honesty was the best response. I am indeed facing such a decision, Marcus nodded, his expression grave. I want you to know that whatever you decide, I believe you should have complete information about all your options, not just those that have been presented to you by others. Charlotte tilted her head, puzzled by his phrasing. What do you mean? I mean, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, that there may be alternatives that haven't been fully explored, solutions that could address the kingdom's needs without requiring you to sacrifice your own happiness and autonomy. Charlotte felt her heart begin to race. What kind of alternatives? Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense with the passion of someone who had clearly given the matter extensive thought. I have been researching the historical records of similar situations faced by other kingdoms. There have been cases where creative diplomatic solutions have resolved financial crises without requiring strategic marriages. Trade partnerships, resource-sharing agreements, even innovative taxation systems that distribute burdens more equitably. Charlotte's mind immediately began working through the possibilities he was suggesting. But surely my father and his advisors have considered such options. Perhaps, Marcus replied. But sometimes those closest to a problem can become so focused on conventional solutions that they miss innovative alternatives. And sometimes, he paused, seeming to choose his words very carefully. Advisors have their own interests that might be served by promoting certain solutions over others. The implication of his words hit Charlotte like a physical force. She had always trusted Lord Blackwood and the other advisors completely, never questioning whether their counsel might be influenced by factors beyond the kingdom's welfare. Are you suggesting that Lord Blackwood might have ulterior motives? She asked quietly. Marcus hesitated, clearly aware that he was venturing into dangerous territory by questioning the integrity of a high-ranking court official. I am suggesting that it might be wise to seek additional perspectives before making such a momentous decision. Lord Blackwood is certainly committed to the kingdom's welfare, but he may also have political relationships and obligations that influence his recommendations. Charlotte sat back in her chair, her mind reeling with this new way of viewing her situation. She had been so focused on accepting or rejecting the marriage proposal that she hadn't seriously considered whether there might be entirely different solutions to explore. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. I'm proposing that you ask the difficult questions, Marcus replied, his voice carrying an urgency that suggested he had been planning this conversation for days. Question the assumptions underlying the marriage proposal. Demand detailed information about exactly how the alliance would solve the kingdom's problems. Insist on exploring alternative solutions with the same thoroughness that has been applied to the marriage option. Charlotte felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Not the passive hope that things would somehow work out for the best, but the active hope that came from realizing she might have more agency in her situation than she had previously understood. And if my questions reveal that the marriage truly is the best solution available, she asked, then you will make that choice knowing that you explored every option and acted based on complete information rather than accepting someone else's conclusions, Marcus replied. But if your questions reveal other possibilities, then you will have opened doors that might otherwise have remained permanently closed. Charlotte stood and moved to the library window, looking out at the gardens where they had first discussed these matters. The familiar view looked different now, charged with new possibilities rather than serving as a beautiful backdrop for her resignation to an unwanted fate. You're asking me to challenge my father and his advisors, she said, not turning away from the window, to question their wisdom and their motives. I'm asking you to fulfill your responsibility as the future queen, to make informed decisions based on your own careful analysis, Marcus replied, also standing. That's not a challenge to their authority, it's an embrace of your own. Charlotte turned back to face him, and Marcus could see that something fundamental had shifted in her expression. The sadness and resignation that had characterized her demeanor for the past several days were being replaced by a determination that made her look more like the confident princess he had always admired. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there moments before. "I have been so focused on being a dutiful daughter that I forgot I also have a responsibility to be a thoughtful future queen. Those responsibilities may sometimes conflict, but I need to find a way to honor both." Marcus felt a surge of pride and relief at her words. He had taken an enormous risk in speaking so directly about matters that were far beyond his official purview, but seeing the renewed sense of purpose in Princess Charlotte's eyes convinced him that the risk had been worthwhile. "How do you suggest I proceed?" Charlotte asked, and Marcus could hear that she was already thinking strategically about how to approach the conversations that lay ahead. "Carefully," he replied with a slight smile, "but also courageously. You have every right to ask detailed questions about matters that will affect your life so profoundly. Start with requesting comprehensive information about the specific terms of the proposed alliance, the exact financial benefits it would provide, and the detailed timeline for how those benefits would address the kingdom's current challenges." Charlotte nodded, her mind already planning the conversations she would need to have with her parents and with Lord Blackwood. For the first time in days, she felt like herself again. Not just a passive recipient of other people's decisions, but an active participant in shaping her own destiny and that of her kingdom. The morning of Prince Roderick's arrival dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the palace windows and casting everything in sharp relief. Charlotte had spent the previous evening preparing for the conversation she planned to have with her parents before the formal introductions began, and she felt more centered and purposeful than she had in weeks. Armed with the questions that Marcus had helped her formulate, and bolstered by her own renewed sense of agency, Charlotte made her way to her father's private study where she had requested a meeting. The familiar room, with its shelves of leather-bound books and walls lined with portraits of previous monarchs, usually made her feel connected to the long history of wise rulers who had faced their own impossible decisions. Today, however, she felt less like she was seeking guidance from the past and more like she was preparing to write her own chapter in that ongoing story. King Edmund looked up from his correspondence as she entered, and Charlotte could see immediately that the stress of recent weeks had taken its toll on him. There were new lines around his eyes, and his usually confident bearing seemed somewhat diminished. The sight filled her with both sympathy for his position and determination to ensure that whatever solution they pursued would truly serve everyone's best interests. "Father," she said, offering the appropriate courtesy before taking the seat he indicated across from his desk. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me before Prince Roderick's arrival." "Of course, my dear," King Edmund replied, though Charlotte could detect a note of wariness in his voice, as though he suspected she might have concerns about the proposed marriage. "I imagine you have questions about the day's proceedings." "I do have questions," Charlotte confirmed, "though perhaps not the ones you might expect." King Edmund leaned back in his chair, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." Charlotte took a breath, drawing on the clarity of purpose she had discovered during her conversations with Marcus. "I would like to understand the specific terms of the alliance being proposed with Astoria, not just the general concept, but the detailed financial arrangements and the timeline for how those arrangements would address our kingdom's current challenges." She saw surprise flicker across her father's face, followed by what looked like a mixture of pride and concern. Clearly, he hadn't expected her to approach the matter with such strategic thinking. "Those are very sophisticated questions," he said slowly. "What has prompted this particular line of inquiry?" "The recognition that I have a responsibility to understand fully any decision that will affect both my life and the welfare of our people," Charlotte replied, her voice steady and confident. "I realize I have been approaching this matter too passively, accepting others' conclusions rather than developing my own understanding of the situation." King Edmund studied her face for several moments, and Charlotte could see him reassessing her in light of this new assertiveness. "Very well," he said finally. "Let me explain the specifics of what Astoria has offered." Over the next hour, Charlotte listened as her father outlined the financial details of the proposed alliance. Astoria would provide immediate monetary support to address the treasury shortfall, along with favorable trade agreements that would increase long-term revenue. In exchange, the kingdoms would be united through marriage, and Astoria would gain access to Valdoria's strategic ports and influence over certain policy decisions. As her father spoke, Charlotte took careful notes, asking clarifying questions about timelines, specific amounts, and the mechanisms by which the proposed solutions would be implemented. She also inquired about the political implications of giving Astoria influence over Valdoria's domestic policies, a concern that seemed to surprise King Edmund. "I hadn't expected you to focus on the sovereignty implications," he admitted. "That shows remarkable political insight." "Thank you," Charlotte replied. "Now I'd like to ask about alternative solutions that might have been considered." She saw her father's expression shift, becoming more guarded. "What sort of alternatives?" Charlotte consulted her notes, feeling grateful for Marcus's guidance in preparing for this conversation. "Have we explored restructuring our existing taxation system to reduce the burden on the northern provinces while maintaining revenue? Have we investigated new trade partnerships with kingdoms other than Astoria? Have we considered innovative approaches to resource management that might reduce our military expenditures without compromising security?" King Edmund was quiet for several moments, clearly processing both her questions and the fact that she had obviously given the matter extensive independent thought. "Some of those options have been discussed," he said finally, "though perhaps not with the thoroughness you're suggesting they deserve." "Why not?" Charlotte asked, her tone respectful but persistent. Her father looked uncomfortable, and Charlotte sensed that she was approaching the heart of something important. "Lord Blackwood has been our primary advisor on these matters, and he has extensive experience with similar situations. His recommendation was that the marriage alliance represented our best option for achieving both immediate stability and long-term prosperity."
I say what I mean to do.
Charlotte felt her pulse quicken as she recognized an opportunity to delve deeper into the dynamics that Marcus had suggested might be influencing the decision-making process. "Has Lord Blackwood provided detailed analyses of alternative approaches?" she asked. "I would very much like to review those analyses before meeting with Prince Roderick." King Edmund shifted in his chair, and Charlotte could see that her request had touched on something that made him uncomfortable. Lord Blackwood's assessments had been primarily verbal, based on his extensive experience and knowledge of regional politics. Charlotte felt a flash of insight that made several pieces of the puzzle suddenly click into place. "Father, forgive me for asking, but does Lord Blackwood have any personal or political relationships with Astoria that might influence his perspective on this alliance?" The question clearly caught King Edmund off guard, and Charlotte could see him struggling with how to respond. His hesitation was answer enough. "I see," Charlotte said quietly. "So Lord Blackwood may have additional motivations for promoting this particular solution." "Lord Blackwood is a loyal advisor who has served our family faithfully for many years," King Edmund said, but his tone lacked the conviction Charlotte would have expected if he had complete confidence in his advisor's objectivity. Charlotte leaned forward, pressing what she sensed was an advantage. "Father, I'm not questioning Lord Blackwood's loyalty or his years of service, but I am questioning whether we have given adequate consideration to all possible solutions before committing to one that will irrevocably alter my life and potentially compromise our kingdom's independence." King Edmund was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the courtyard where preparations for Prince Roderick's arrival were continuing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested he had been harboring his own doubts about the path they were pursuing. "What are you proposing, Charlotte?" "I'm proposing that we postpone any formal commitments until we have thoroughly explored alternatives with the same rigor that we would apply to any other major policy decision," Charlotte replied. "Prince Roderick's visit can proceed as planned, but as an opportunity for preliminary discussions rather than formal negotiations. And if our exploration of alternatives reveals that the marriage alliance truly is our best option." Charlotte had anticipated this question, and she had spent considerable time preparing her response. "Then I will enter into that marriage with the confidence that comes from making an informed decision based on complete information. But if we discover other viable solutions, then we will have prevented a potentially unnecessary sacrifice, while also identifying approaches that better serve both kingdoms' long-term interests." King Edmund looked at his daughter with an expression that combined surprise, pride, and a growing respect for her political acumen. "You've given this matter considerable thought." "I have," Charlotte confirmed. "And I've realized that my responsibility as the future queen requires me to be an active participant in decisions that affect our people, not simply a passive recipient of others' conclusions." The conversation continued for another hour. during which Charlotte presented a detailed proposal for conducting a comprehensive review of alternative solutions within a specified time frame. Her father agreed to postpone any formal commitments and to establish a committee that would include advisors beyond Lord Blackwood to ensure multiple perspectives were considered. As their meeting concluded, Charlotte felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had not only asserted her right to be fully informed about decisions affecting her future, but had also potentially opened pathways that could benefit everyone involved. Later that afternoon, as she prepared to meet Prince Roderick for the first time since learning of the marriage proposal, Charlotte felt fundamentally different than she had just a week earlier. The sadness and resignation that had characterized her initial response to the news had been replaced by a sense of empowerment and purpose. The meeting with Prince Roderick proceeded cordially, with both parties maintaining the diplomatic courtesy appropriate to the occasion, while avoiding any discussion of specific commitments. Charlotte found herself observing him with new eyes, evaluating not just his suitability as a potential husband, but also his character, his motivations, and his vision for the kind of alliance their kingdoms might forge. As the day concluded, Charlotte reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed through the simple act of asking the right questions and insisting on her right to be fully informed. The future remained uncertain, but she now faced it as an active agent in shaping her own destiny rather than as a passive recipient of others' decisions. Standing once again in the garden where her conversation with Marcus had first opened her eyes to new possibilities, Charlotte felt a profound gratitude for the courage that Gard had shown in speaking honestly about matters far beyond his official responsibilities. His willingness to challenge her assumptions and encourage her to claim her own agency had transformed not just her approach to this particular decision, but her understanding of her role as a future queen. The smile that had faded from Princess Charlotte's face a week earlier had returned, but it was different now. Not the expression of someone trying to maintain appearances despite private distress, but the genuine happiness of someone who had discovered her own strength and was prepared to use it wisely in service of both her personal fulfillment and her people's welfare.